All right, so now we are talking about long-term memory, and this is, in some ways, honestly, I feel like it's a little bit shorter than you might expect. Partly because it has long in the title, right? But also just because we're going to be talking about a lot of long-term memory in Chapter 7 and in Chapter 8. So you can think of this as kind of an introduction to long-term memory. But mostly I want to talk about it in its kind of relationship to the other forms of memory. To talk about it in relation to these other components, the sensory memory and the short-term memory. All right, so there are 6 things that I want you to think about whenever we are talking about long-term memory. These are all neurofocused, so they all have to do with how the brain works. So the first is to think about, keep in mind that neurons are flexible. That's going to be important, that neurons can change how they wire together. The second is that the connections between neurons can strengthen or weaken. And I'll put these together in just a moment. The third is that the more connections between neurons are used, the stronger and easier and more efficient those connections get. The fourth is that if connections between neurons are not used, those connections can weaken. The fifth is that new connections across neurons are made all the time, and it's something that happens throughout our life and throughout experience. And the sixth piece is that neurons don't live forever, that they do eventually die or decay. Okay, so we got these 6 things. Why are these 6 things important? Because these tell us a lot about how long-term memory is created and maintained in the brain. That basically what long-term memory is are different connections between and across neurons. That some of these connections can get stronger, some of them can get weaker. If you have a long-term memory that is getting stronger, it's because the connections across those neurons are getting stronger. They're getting more efficient. They're tying together more clearly. Those connections are getting more frequent. If something is getting worse in long-term memory, if you're less likely to remember it, then it's probably because those connections are weakening then. So, basically, what I want you to think about is whenever you're thinking about memory, think about these 6 different topics because they're important. They will help kind of guide the way on how to understand this stuff. So, for example, if there is something in your memory that you think about a lot, that is going to be more enduring. It is going to last longer because the more you use these connections, the stronger and longer lasting it is. And vice versa is true. If you learn something, let's say from a class you took last semester, but you never think about it, you're more likely to lose that information. All right. So spreading activation is one way of conceptualizing long-term memory. And spreading activation is simply that whenever you invoke a memory, it's going to invoke other memories nearby. So in other words, to put it into a more neurologically friendly way, whenever you activate one cluster of neurons, you're also going to be likely to activate the neighboring areas of neurons as well, or you're more likely to. And so in that way, memory activation spreads. If you activate one memory, you're going to activate neighboring memories as well. And that explains things like priming and schemas. We'll talk about those later this semester. But basically, it explains how some of the cognitive phenomena that we are going to talk about a lot, actually, in chapters 9, 10, 11. All right, so here is an example of that. How if, for example, if I were to say the word fish, you may also think about water, you may also think about fins, you may also think about swimming, you may also think about gills, you may think about sharks, you may think about salmon. And if you do think about salmon, you may think about pink, you may think about food, etc. So by activating this one specific memory, it's going to be activating these nearby memories too. So that's what we mean by spreading activation. And that if you activate fish, that activates salmon, that can also activate pink and edible. If we were to activate the word canary, you're also going to be activating birds. You're also going to be activating singing, the idea of yellow, idea of pets, and so on. So you get the idea. So what is priming? I mentioned that earlier. Basically, priming is whenever the presence of a stimulus influences your ability to remember or to respond to a different stimulus. So basically, in this particular study, this is mentioned in your book very briefly, these researchers had people make responses, make decisions, make judgments about whether or not a pair of words were related or not. So they were just saying, actually I take that back. They were assessing whether or not they were real words or fake words. And depending on if those words were related, if they were associated in any way, then people responded much more quickly for those than they did for when they were not. So, for example, if I gave you the word bread and skull, you'd respond very quickly that those are both words, right? But if I gave you the words bread and butter, you would respond even faster that they are both words. Why? Or that they're both words and not fake words. Why? Because whenever you activate the word butter, and you're thinking about that, you're also more likely to go ahead and also activate the word butter. Sorry, I got that wrong. Bread, if you hear the word bread, you're likely to activate the word butter, and vice versa. If you hear the word butter, you're more likely to activate the word bread. So basically that spreading activation is going to give you an advantage. You're going to respond a little bit faster than you would if those words were unrelated whatsoever. So here is another way in which and the reason why this is priming, and again, what priming is how the presence of a stimulus can affect the way that you respond to another stimulus. That the reason why this is priming is that the presence of one stimulus, this word bread, is going to affect the way that you respond to that subsequent word. So here's another example. For the word stem completion task, as quickly as you can, respond to what these words are. Fill them out. So tell me what these words are. Add a few letters and turn them into words. So if you were paying attention in the working memory video, I gave you a list of words. And I gave you the list of words: moth, supreme, crayon, banner, and then 10 others or something like that. If you paid attention and you tried to remember those, you probably completed those using the word moth, supreme, crayon, and banner. And you did that even though those are relatively unlikely words to be used completed here. If you weren't paying attention to that list, you're more likely to use the word motel or super or crazy, because those are much more common words than moth, supreme, or crayon. All right, so that's priming. That is how, and that goes back to spreading activation. That whenever you activate one memory, it's going to activate others. So if you were to activate the word moth, you're more likely to activate the neighboring words, which may be supreme and crayon and banner and the other words that you learned in that particular video. All right, so the last few things I want to mention is that for long-term memory, it obeys what's called the power law of learning. So this is specifically looking at how we practice things over time, and I hesitated to even put this stuff in here, but I think that it's important to also remember that long-term memory can also be about things other than simply remembering lists of words. So what you're looking at here is essentially how well you do on a task over time. And in this case, I want to say that this was looking at how quickly people can spot certain words in a word bank. And so what they find is that on the first day of practicing this, it takes roughly about 1.6 seconds for somebody to spot the specific word they're supposed to be looking for. And then the second day, it takes them 1.4, and the next day 1.2, and then the next day almost 1 second. And then you can see as the days go on, that drop is way less dramatic, right? It starts flattening out into a curve, and then it starts getting even flatter and flatter and flatter. As the days go on, there's less of an increase in your performance. So that is true, like those of you that play sports, those of you that play instruments, those of you that play video games know this to be well. I know this to be true. That think about how well you do the first day of practice. The first day you learned to play piano or guitar, you learned a couple of chords. Wow, that's awesome. You learned a ton. But if you've been playing guitar for 10 years and you sit in your room and practice for 2 hours, you generally are not really going to learn almost anything. You're just going to be honing in on your technique. You're just going to be getting a little bit better, perhaps, than you were the day before. That is called the power law of learning. It follows a logarithmic scale, so that if you were to apply a log function, you'll see that it follows more of a linear trend. Basically, we have diminishing returns as we continue to practice. All right, so the last thing that I want to mention is about long-term potentiation. Long-term potentiation is essentially the neural mechanism for long-term memory. And this goes back to those 6 important things that I mentioned at the beginning of this video. So what long-term potentiation is essentially the power law that we looked at in this previous graph as applied to neurons that are being connected. The first time neurons connect with one another, the first time they communicate with one another, I guess I should say, is they rapidly change and make pretty strong changes in their connection across synapses. But the more they interact with one another, the slower those changes become. So in other words, the most growth, both in these neural connections but also in your practice, is going to be in the first few times of accessing that memory, of doing that particular task. As you do it more frequently, it takes more and more work to keep creating more connections or more improvements on those behaviors. So that's what long-term potentiation is. One way to think about it is the phrase, you use it or you lose it. That's true for memories. If memories are not reactivated, if they are not retrieved over a period of time, we begin to lose our ability to access them because the connections that are governing those across neurons are lost. And that can impact how easily or how readily we can access that information. Here is a really cool drawing of long-term potentiation in the hippocampus. I actually don't know who drew this out. I think somebody drew this and put it online because they're part of a study group or something like that. And you don't need to know all these different things, but some of these things are important to know, like this piece up here, that long-term potentiation occurs because of high frequencies of stimulation across synapses, and that it increases the effectiveness of that synapse as a result. You don't need to know about calcium channels. You don't need to know about calcium ions. You don't need to know about NMDA and these different kinds of amino acids that are used in this stuff. If you do want to know more about that, though, physiological psychology is the class for you. But we are off onto other forms of memory. We're going into Chapter 7 to talk about how memory works. We've talked about what memory is in this video, in this chapter. Now we're going to be talking about how it works. Okay, I'll see you there.